It's a nearly unbelievable chapter in Oregon history. A guru from India and thousands of his followers, known as Rajneeshis, created a commune headquarters in Central Oregon, near the tiny town of Antelope in the early 1980s. 40 years ago this fall, the community, known as Rajneeshpuram, collapsed amid attempted assassinations, poisonings, and criminal charges. But there's a story about the controversial spiritual movement you haven't heard. What happened to the commune children? Sarito Carroll was one of those children, and she has written a memoir about her experience at Rajneeshpuram. I sat down with her to find out why, after 4 decades, she's breaking her silence. A warning, her story and this interview are explicit and involve sexual abuse and the trauma it caused. Hello everyone, I'm Laural Porter and I'm joined by author Sarito Carroll. Sarito was 12 years old when she first arrived at the community known as Rajneeshpuram, a controversial spiritual community, a cult that was established near Antelope, Oregon in the early 1980s. 40 years after its collapse, she's written a memoir, In the Shadow of Enlightenment. She's breaking her silence about her experience there as a child in the commune. For those who've seen the 2018 Netflix docuseries Wild Wild Country, she says it's pretty accurate, but there are things that were left out. What happened to the kids? Here is the rest of the story. And I do want to mention that Sarito is a survivor of sexual abuse, and her story involves abuse and trauma. Sarito, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story with us.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, for people who may not know, tell us about the guru Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh and what this spiritual movement is all about.
Right, so Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh was from India, and in the mid-70s, he started gathering Western devotees. And I think it was very much to do with the sign of the times, you know, the hippie movement, the kind of sexual liberation, women's lib, and a lot of rebellious hippies and such, kind of sort of looking for something different than the status quo and trying to push the boundaries. And I think maybe too there was just a more open sense of people looking for real meaning in their lives as they sort of pushed against the traditional constraints of society.
What was the promise of the community?
So Rajneesh, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, he promised liberation, enlightenment, spiritual awakening. So freedom from suffering and joy and celebration. And unlike other gurus who were like, you need to meditate 12 hours a day, he was all about celebrate life, live to the fullest. There's no mores, there's no restrictions. You just need to be true to who you really are. And so that appealed a lot to Westerners who probably from the 50s grew up in more structured households and things. And I think Eastern religion and spirituality had sort of seeped into Western culture by then. You know, the Beatles went to India at that point. And so it was very much an extension of, I'd say, the hippie movement to a large extent, or just alternative movement.
So it's been 40 years since the commune in Oregon, which we'll talk about, collapsed.
Yeah.
Why, after 4 decades, have you decided to write this book and break your silence about your experience there?
Yeah. So I guess it's taken me 40 years because it was a lot of trauma to process and a lot of fear that held me back. And it's not that I haven't thought about it for these 4 years. In fact, it's been a big theme of my life. And it's sort of kept its tentacles on me. And I think it's taken me 40 years to find the courage to say, this is who I am. I'm no longer this person that so many people wanted me to be. I was a very good chameleon. I played the part of the perfect little cult kid, you know, or the cute little tween cult kid, you know. And so I was very good at adapting. And so it took me a long time, firstly, to build up the self-confidence. And I also just felt like it was still burdening me in my current life. You know, sort of like I'm traumatized, and there's shame with that. And so part of why I wanted to write it is to sort of unload it and also destigmatize trauma. Like it doesn't mean you're ruined forever. It just means that's what you have to work with.
The Netflix documentary a lot of people might have seen, Wild Wild Country.
Yeah.
You've told me that it was pretty accurate, but what did it miss? What did it leave out?
Yeah, so it was pretty accurate in terms of the political and sort of the challenges with the outside world, but it didn't show the daily life of people there. And it most certainly did not show the story of the kids, the children like me. Like, we were not even mentioned, I don't believe, maybe once. And so that's actually when I was very kind of inspired, or I guess even triggered, to say, hey, this isn't the whole story. And that's actually when I started writing seriously my memoir, because I felt like that the aspect of the children was missing, especially my story, which for so many years people are like, oh, you grew up in this great environment, you're so lucky, and I just got like have this sinking feeling like you have no idea. And even people who knew what was happening to the children, it's sort of like they had a blank in their memory, like they didn't see it as a problem. And so that just, it almost made me nauseous every time I faced that kind of feedback. And so I felt like I needed to set the record straight, and first and foremost for myself, but I also know that I represent others who are in the commune, that many maybe don't want to speak out, but it's not, my story is not unique.
How many young people were in the commune?
Well, so in the Oregon itself, I'd say there was 100 or so, and that's including younger children as well. As far as teenagers or tweens, maybe 40, 50. But then there were also communes, like satellite communes all over Europe, and there were children there too. And only after I wrote my book, or while I was writing it, did I learn that many of the children there also suffered abuse by adult men.
What do you want people to know about what did happen to the kids, to the tweens, the teens?
Yeah. Well, what did happen is that we were basically brought to the commune by a parent or two parents and sort of left to our own devices. So one of Rajneesh's teachings was that the children belonged to the commune, not to the parents. And I think for many of these parents who were looking for liberation, that was like a relief in some ways. Like, they didn't have to be daily parents. They could just sort of weave in and out of their children's lives as it suited them. And some, it didn't suit them at all. And so some children were pretty much abandoned by their parents. And so we were free to do mostly what we wanted. We didn't go to traditional school. Like, I probably stepped foot in a school like a couple of weeks or a few weeks of my whole time in Oregon.
No structured education?
No structured education. We were supposed to learn from experience. And so we had this thing called School Without Walls, where I worked 12, 16 hours a day alongside the adults, and I got school credit for it, but I wasn't actually learning to read and write or math.
So you were expected to help build the community. You were expected to work.
Oh yeah, 12 hours a day, 16 hours a day. And the kids worked in all different departments. I worked in the office. So I was sort of in the inner circle, like in Sheila's posse, all the women who ran the commune. And so I did sort of menial office work, and I sort of had an easy ride at that, but it was still 12 hours a day where you had to be there. Other kids were doing construction. Some of them got injured. It was not the right environment for kids to prepare for adulthood.
What do you want people who read your book, watch this interview, what do you want them to take away from your story?
I really want them to get that when they see OSHO quotes, OSHO's his name now, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh changed his name to OSHO when he left America. I want people to understand that underneath this shiny veneer of this community that was espousing a utopia and love and joy and freedom, and even as it was depicted in Wild Wild Country, I mean, I think they gave it a pretty positive slant. They're not showing the darker undercurrents of the corruption, the crimes, and the neglect and the abuse of children. And so what I really want is for people not to be kind of deceived by the glossy presentation or the pretty words.
Well, we're going to talk about your personal experience, but I want to back up just a little bit to your early years. You and your mom were like wandering hippies, you described it, and you lived in an animal stall in Colorado, a makeshift shack in Hawaii, but you ended up in India. Your mom heard about the guru, she'd read some of his books, she wanted to meet him, so you went to India. You thought it was for a visit, but it wasn't just a visit, right?
Correct. So it was So my whole childhood was very much wandering hippies. We were moving every year or every even 6 months. And I was always looking to sort of settle somewhere. And so we finally had moved to Kauai after being 3 other places in Hawaii. And I started in a school that I actually liked, and I started making friends.
You're about 9?
I was 9. And then my mom, whenever she sort of sat me down to say, okay, we need to talk, I was always like, oh no, we're gonna move again. But she's like, oh no, I just want to go to India for 3 months for your summer vacation, and then we'll come back and you can go back to school. And I was resistant, but I said, okay. And I think she didn't think we would stay. But needless to say, we arrive at the ashram in India, and it's this sort of idyllic, very open, loving environment, and everyone's meditating all day, and everyone's hugging, and it's just very open. I don't know what else to call it. And I sort of fit in too. It was sort of like you're immediately pulled into this sort of bigger family, and the next thing you know, I don't even know if the topic came up about leaving, but we stayed, and we were there for 3 years until it closed and the commune moved to Oregon.
What was your life like in India? Because there was some abuse that happened there too,
There
right?
was. And you know what, so this is the nature of how insidious the abuse was, is that the incident in India almost doesn't faze me because it's so minor compared to the severity of the abuse later. And so I'm just calling that out because that's still somewhat of that commune conditioning to think, oh, it's not so bad. And so yes, when I was 9, so most of the time in Pune was quite fun. I lived in the ashram. I knew all the people in charge. I was sort of spunky and just ran around and delivered messages and played, and had other people my age. So I felt like for the first time I had real friends, and I felt a place where I belonged. But then when I was about 10, me and another girl, it started out we would hang out with the guards that were guarding Rajneesh's house in the evening during what they called darshan, when he was meeting with disciples. And so the sexual abuse there started when one of the guards taught us how to French kiss.
And you were 9 or 10?
Yeah, I'm not sure, I must have been 10. And there was a lot of sex around. So that was the first direct experience like that. And for some reason I blocked that out a lot because it just seemed like it was so normal that I thought it was normal. It was just so normal for sex to be everywhere. We'd walk by, we could hear people, see people having sex, or bathe in these group showers with adult men, making out with people.
And no one said anything about it. No one thought it was wrong. Anything was wrong with it.
No, because one of Rajneesh's main teachings was don't have taboo on sexuality. Sexuality is natural. Go with your energy.
Even with children.
Yes. So and he even did speak slightly. I've heard him talk about that. I don't have all the references, but saying it's good for children to watch their parents or adults having sex, so that they'll be familiar, or something. I don't know the exact quote, but it was very much like it's out in the open, it shouldn't be taboo, so they can experience it. And so it's basically teaching us how to be partner swapper, how to be polyamorous from a very young age.
And this continues on, and we'll talk about it in Oregon. That's where your trauma began. Yeah. Let me just ask you about the Bwan. What did you have any personal interactions with him? What was he like?
I basically met with him twice, and the first was when I took initiation, and that's when you're given the necklace with his picture, and he touches you on the forehead and he gives you a new name.
The cover of your book, right?
Correct.
Okay.
So that's me taking initiation at 9. And so in that situation, it was the only time I actually spoke to him.
And did he give you a new name then?
Yes, that's when I got the name Sarito, so my name was Jennifer, and he changed my name to Ma Prem Sarito. Ma denotes I'm a female, Prem is a prefix which means love, and river is the meaning of Sarito. So everyone's given a new name so to be symbolic of shedding your own identity, your old identity, and coming into a new identity as a disciple that's surrendered to him and his teachings.
Well, there were problems in India with the Indian government, unpaid taxes, all kinds of problems with the police. So the ashram, the community, moved to Oregon.
Correct.
You were one of the first 35 settlers to arrive in Antelope, Oregon, this huge sprawling ranch.
Yep.
How did you end up there? And you went by yourself, not with your mom.
Yeah. So how I ended up there is, well, the commune fell, and I was by that point like pretty close to one woman in particular who was like second in command of the ashram. And I had, for those 3 years in India, I had very little to do with my mother, so I felt more sort of attached to these stand-in mother figures. And I did leave briefly with my mom. We went back to Hawaii when this all fell apart, but I was extremely distraught, and all I wanted was to be back in the new commune, and we didn't know if it was even going to happen. So I was just like, please, please, at that point, because that was the only home I really knew. Needless to say, I got a number for Sheila, who was in New Jersey with Bwan and his whole posse, and I called her, and that's when she told me they bought the Big Muddy Ranch in Central Oregon. And, that's what it was called at the time, the Big Muddy Ranch. And I was just like, okay. And she said, well, there's a few people there just starting to go there to create our new commune. You can go there. And so I went ahead of my mom, mostly just because of money, and also like I was sort of, if you think of hierarchies, all these kind of cultic communities have hierarchies. So I was actually above her in the hierarchy, which is kind of bizarre that the daughter would be above their mother. But I was like the pet child in the office. So I got to Oregon when I was the 32nd person to arrive at the Big Muddy Ranch.
And what were your first impressions?
Oh my goodness. Well, firstly, I had flown from Hawaii to Oregon, and I stayed with some strangers that we met at the airport because I had to catch a bus the next day to Madras. And I didn't know where any of this was, right? I mean, I'd never been to Oregon, at least not as someone who could remember, maybe when I was like 2 or 3. And so the first thing I realized was, oh my gosh, I'm dressed like a clown, because I was wearing an orange dress and my, emaciated from living in India, and this long, unkempt hair, and the mala and flip-flops. And so I arrive in Madras on the Greyhound bus to be picked up, and it's like cowboy land. And then once I got picked up, I was taken at how out in the middle of nowhere it was, and also just the vast landscape. I mean, it felt like
very different than India.
Very different, because there it was very hustle bustle, sounds, monkeys and rickshaws and, chaos. And this was serene and almost like a wasteland to some extent, but a beautiful wasteland. Yeah.
Once you got to the ranch, what was life like there for your age group, the youth?
Yeah. So at the very beginning, there was only me and one other kid, and then we basically played, and so I just did my own thing. Once more people arrived, more youth arrived, there was a couple attempts of trying to have school, but it never went anywhere. So we just worked. We were assigned jobs just like the adults.
So for a while you went to the Antelope School?
That was a little later,
okay,
which I think was tied to sort of political things of trying to say, we're trying to take over the town of Antelope at that point. And so the kids were going to Antelope School, but in the beginning not. We were just working.
So when more people arrived, what did life become like in the community?
It became mostly work. So we'd work from 7:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. So we'd all be off and around. And as the teens and stuff, we still sort of goofed off a lot. But in the office, I felt like I was always trying to be the example of good behavior. But there was some goofing around. But the main social scene was in the evenings at the cafeteria. That's when everyone, finished a long day of work, met, had dinner together, and usually found who they were going to sleep with that night. That was kind of the scene. And yeah. So
we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. What were your friendships like? Did you have some friendships with some of the other young people?
Well, I had very close friendships with 3 other girls when I was in India. And so those friendships endured, but as time went on, I got pulled further into the Jesus Grove Sheila cohort, office cohort, whereas the other kids were out in the commune doing their things. And so I did feel sort of left out, but I also felt special for being in the inner circle. So I'd say that actually as things got bigger, I felt more alone.
Did you have any interactions with the people outside in Antelope at all?
No, never.
Pretty much isolated.
We were basically told that they hated us and they were bigots and we shouldn't interact with them. I mean, I heard a lot of conversations in Jesus Grove, Sheila's house, mentioning certain people like Margaret Hill and saying horrible things about people, like local people. And that's all I knew. So I'm like, oh, these people are horrible. And what do you do when you're that age and you don't have anything to compare it to?
You talked about Sheila, the personal secretary to the Bwan. Tell us what she was like. Who was Sheila?
Well, in the beginning, she just seemed like she was this firecracker full of energy, just going to get stuff done and a lot of fun. And, I'd go on trips with her to Antelope and, we just hang out and goof around. But as things developed, she became much more intense and bossy and authoritative and I guess almost like stern. She could be extremely scolding. Like her level of charm and charisma, the flip side of that was just like a severe sense of authority. And you were not going to mess with her. So she was intimidating.
And this group of people you called the moms, who were they?
So the moms were basically Sheila, and then all the people who were running the commune were essentially women. And so Bwan always said he thought women would be better at running things. And so, maybe it's true, but he was still ultimately in charge, right? But so Sheila basically assembled all these other sort of deputies to her that were also women, and they were just collectively called the moms. And there were moms of different departments, like they'd run different things. And so all the departments were called temples. The women who ran them were moms.
And where was your mom now? Because she's now at the ranch.
Yeah, she arrived like a month or something after I did. And our relationship became more estranged. Like after she arrived, we barely interacted for 4 years.
When did you become aware of some of the darker elements of what was happening at the ranch, some of the criminal activity?
I think I saw hints of it, but I didn't dare think of it as such at the time. But I remember like a lot of secrets being told, and again, like sort of bad-mouthing all these people from outside, whether it be the Attorney General or Margaret Hill or just various names that I heard. And it was always really, bad. And then also, I think I knew about the arranged marriages very early on. Like that almost seemed like a soft crime compared to the other crimes.
And what are you talking about, bringing people from other countries?
Like very early on, it was that the moms, or even people would do it on their own, would basically hook up with an American. A foreigner would hook up with an American just to get a visa so that they could come to Oregon. Because all the devotees around the world, like their main goal in life was to get to the commune and be again with their master.
Because this was considered the headquarters.
It was the headquarters, and there's this notion that the closer in proximity you are to the enlightened being, that it can sort of be contagious for you and it's advantageous for your own spiritual growth. And so people just wanted to sit again at his feet.
So that's where the immigration fraud comes in.
Yeah, and then also there's probably a practical element too, that some people had certain skills that Sheila or them needed at the ranch, and they may have been foreigners. So those people maybe got priority and were hooked up with other key figures in the commune.
Did you have any inkling about the bioterror attack? What happened with the poisoning of the salad bars?
I did not know until later. I mean, it was so shocking to me. I knew that there was all these people in Jesus Grove where I lived, at Sheila's house. There was always these people coming and going in civilian clothes. And I was always thinking something fishy is going on, but I knew it wasn't my place to ask, and so I didn't.
What was the atmosphere like at the commune when the federal investigators moved in?
It was scary, especially for me because, maybe for everybody, but suddenly Sheila and her gang had run away in the middle of the night. They had gone to Germany, and then like a month or something later, Bwan leaves. And I guess the investigators came in after Sheila left. But for me, I was just so disoriented because these were the people who were my role models. And suddenly they're gone. And I don't know who to turn to. And I'm not very close to my mother. And the new people in charge were the ones that hate the people who were my role models. And then the guru's dissing these people who I thought were the authorities, for the last 7 years of my life. So I was just sort of bewildered and had no idea what was going to happen next. So it was a lot of fear, a lot of fear.
I'm going to ask you about that in a moment, but I want to talk about something now that's really a difficult part of your book. It was really hard to read. As a reader, I can only imagine what it was like for you to endure it and then to write about it. It involves trauma, sex abuse. We've touched on that a little bit. So if you ever want to take a break when we talk about this, I hope that you feel like you can.
I can. Just don't mind me if I get emotional.
Because it is heart-wrenching. But when you were 12 years old, you were raped by an older man who was 29 in the community. You didn't know what was happening at the time. You were confused. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened with this man who abused you?
Yeah, so again, take the culture into context that, you know, love and sex are sort of the same thing and they're open and, you know, there's nothing, the culture sort of didn't have any rules about age of consent, etc. And so when I was 12, at the very beginning of Oregon, when there was only a smaller group of us, this adult man took interest in me and just treated me really kindly, and I was there, you know, lonely, looking to connect. And I thought we were having a romance, a love affair, even though I was somewhat like, okay, there's an age difference, but again, the culture sort of seemed to think it was permissible and it wasn't totally, you know, hidden. And so that evolved to the point that within a month or something, he had taken my virginity. And I thought that it was like some kind of, that I was special, I was being chosen as his true love or something. And only later did I realize that he was a notorious womanizer that had slept with almost every woman I knew of, you know, by the time the ranch ended.
And a known pedophile. I mean,
a known pedophile.
You weren't the only teen, were
No,
you?
and again, I thought I was special because I was the only teen amongst all the women he was sleeping with. So it was this sense like I was a special, but then it turned out he was sleeping with my peers, like several of them.
How did you feel about what he'd taken from you?
It's taken me a long time it took a long time for me to recognize it as abuse, because it went on for years, and I think that was a way to suppress the grief, to not call it abuse. And it just feels, it's a sense of you're corroded by someone's energy, or, you know, just the sexual act, you're invaded. And how do you cleanse yourself after that? How do you find your purity that he took? Because I was such a pure, innocent girl. I mean, you can see it in the picture on the cover of my book. I mean, I was just so pure and innocent. And so I became jaded, you know? It really, the long-term effect was that it sort of, I felt a clenching in my heart and a real mistrust, especially with men.
He stole that innocence from you.
Exactly.
And that trust.
Yeah, so I've had to work really hard.
When I read that in your book was so disturbing, and I've told you this, I wanted to hug you, call you and hug you. And I kept wondering, where was your mom in all of this?
Well, she was in the commune, also indoctrinated. A lot of the parents were indoctrinated by the same philosophy, like, oh, it's not that big a deal, or let the kids have their freedom. And I'm sure part of it too is that it's too painful for her to acknowledge. But most of the people from that commune still do not see this as a big deal. It's the way that the commune culture works is that I'm at fault for feeling the way I feel. Because if I was spiritual, I would have just let it go by now.
So victim blaming.
A lot of victim blaming, and in a very sort of sneaky spiritual bypass kind of way.
Where was this group called the Moms? Did they know what was happening? Did anyone say this isn't right?
No, they knew what was happening, but they didn't say it wasn't right. They just told us to be discreet. I was sent to get birth control within 2 weeks of losing my virginity. No one came up to me and said—
When you're 12?
Yeah, when I'm 12. I'm sent to get birth control. No one came up and said, oh, well, we hear that you're sleeping with this guy, and you know maybe that's not a good idea, and you need to stay away from him. No one ever said anything about not interacting with these adult men who were pursuing me and others. And I don't even know who arranged for the contraception, but it had to be one of the moms. I mean, who else is going to do that? No one else has the authority to administer that.
And are there other things like this happening with other teens?
Well, in time, most of the teens I knew were also sleeping with adult men. And then later, after I wrote my book, I found out that it was also some of the boys were being perpetrated by adult women. So it wasn't just the girls. But then also the culture made it so that a lot of our value came from how we appeared. And so we were like sassy and all that. And the girls who were the most sexy got the most attention, and that gave them a sense of value. And I sort of fixated on this one guy, but it still didn't mean, like, by the time I had left the commune, I think I had been with 15 men. And that's a low number. That's a low number. Some of my peers have said that before the age of 16, they had been with 150 adult men.
Oh my God.
So 150 rapes. And
It's
it was
just
all normalized.
Breathtaking.
Yeah.
And no one ever said anything.
No, no. I think
they made a list.
There's a list, so that's the thing. So apparently at some point, maybe some officials were sniffing around. I don't know the details of that. It'd be cool to find that out. But so Sheila and maybe one of the other moms, I'm not sure which one, I was away. I think at that time I was sent to Europe, which I think was also for them to get me out of the way, because my relationship with this one man in particular was very well known. And so if there was any authority sniffing around, I'm assuming that's why they wanted me to be out of the country. I don't know for sure. But Sheila had a couple of the teens create a list of all the men that the teens were involved with sexually. And on that list was at least 100 people's names. Those people were called to a meeting and told to be discreet.
Not to stop.
No, not to stop, to be discreet. Yeah.
What about today? I mean, have you been in touch at all with this man that you had sex with, or that took your virginity? And this went on for several years, right?
Yeah. So
have you reached out to him at all?
So yes, after Wild Wild Country came out, I actually wrote him a long letter detailing the abuse, telling him to take responsibility. At that time I was enraged because he's still traveling around the world as an OSHO representative, going to OSHO gatherings and centers as a musician, and he's much beloved. He's sort of considered what they call old sannyas, and so sort of on a pedestal, kind of like a public face of the movement. He did not respond. And this is like a 5-page letter. It was in my book, the letter's in the book. And so it's not like, a couple paragraphs. It spells out in no uncertain terms how the grooming happened, what he did, how I felt, and how it progressed. Anyway, so he didn't respond. Then about 2 years later, the topic came up again on Facebook in a Rajneesh group. And I had been staying away from anything Rajneesh, but I inadvertently joined this group because I was on the cover photo of it. And I was like, I want that photo, because we didn't have a lot of photos from that time. I have probably 10 photos. So I joined the group. Next thing you know, there's a post about the abuse of children. And there was some kids there saying, my peers, not kids, but my peers saying, oh, I had a wonderful time. I enjoyed my sexual freedom. I thought my blood would boil. And it was the first time that I actually said there was sexual abuse. It wasn't pretty. And I'm not naming any names right now, but it was disgusting. And I realize that you people may not want to see it that way, but this is the law. This is the law. And so at that point, it sort of started this bubbling up of this story coming. And in time, more of my peers started saying, yes, they were abused too. And that they can see that it was abuse. And, so there was sort of a reckoning going on. That just sort of erupted further to the point, like another year later, that some of us actually started to name names. And at that point, many of the people in the community were outraged because they were like, well, we were having a great time. We didn't know this was happening to the children, and we're so sorry. But it ended at sorry. Like, there wasn't ever a group effort to call for accountability of OSHO International Foundation or the perpetrators. It was just like, I'm sorry, and then let's carry on. And there's been this inability to for many to see it as one mechanism that's rotten. It's sort of like, well, the spiritual part was great, and we're sorry this happened. It had only to do with the perpetrators. There's always going to be a few bad seeds in any community. So that kind of dismissal again. And then the people are saying, well, it's been 40 years. Why can't you let this go now? You must have missed the teachings.
What would meaningful accountability look like to you?
At this stage, 40 years later, I think meaningful accountability would have twofold. It would be twofold. Clearly, apologizing is one thing, but I think that there needs to be something more concrete. So from this broader picture of OSHO International Foundation, which is the community in which me and the others were raised, I believe there should be financial compensation to the children. Many of us have dealt with trauma and could use the financial support to pay for that. That, and then on a personal level, I feel the same from the perpetrators. Saying, I'm sorry, love and only love can heal this, let's have therapy together and move on with our beautiful lives, doesn't cut it. And I definitely don't see working through the trauma in therapy with my perpetrator or perpetrators. That's not where my healing has come from.
And there's a group that tried a class action lawsuit, right? What barriers have you run into?
The barriers we've run into is that OSHO International Foundation was created later than the Oregon time period. And so from a legal standpoint, the way I understand it is that they're saying there's no direct lineage. And so therefore they're not responsible.
How do you feel about that?
I feel like it's all twisted and just sort of smoke and mirrors. It's clearly the same organization. And OSHO International Foundation owns the OSHO name, the Rajneesh name, all of his intellectual properties, like 250 books in multiple languages. They have a YouTube channel with 1 million followers, a Instagram channel with 2 million followers. They are promoting themselves a lot, and they're using OSHO's teachings as their means of raising money or as a business venture. So I feel like it's fancy footwork, and the way it's a legal stumble block. But in its core, it's still the OSHO movement, and it's sad that they can't just own responsibility and make a public statement as to how they see this abuse, what they're going to do about it, and what they're going to do to prevent this kind of thing from happening in the future.
How do you feel about Bwan now? OSHO.
I feel sort of sick. To be honest, I never felt especially close to him or drawn to him. I feel like some of the things he said were very wise, and I do feel like that the community that was created felt very warm and welcoming to me and like home to me. So I appreciated his teachings to that extent, but I never had a personal drawing to him. And even in India, I sort of kept my distance. I always thought, ooh, I don't know. There was something that felt sort of off, and maybe it was the sexuality that he promoted that I wasn't comfortable with at that young age. But at this point, I hate to say it, but I see that he was a very disturbed, manipulative man with a lot of charisma and a very bright brain with a lot of good teachings that he had conglomerated from many other sort of lineages.
And what about the materialism? I mean, he had not just one Rolls Royce, but how many did he have?
96, and his goal was to have 365, so he could drive a different one every day of the year. He also had $1 million watches. I mean, it became so megalomaniac. He became a megalomaniac, and as I watched it, it was very off-putting to me, because okay, maybe you don't need to live this austere spiritual life, but you also, it seems very unspiritual to me to need to have 96 Rolls Royces, $1 million watches, and a crew of beautiful women taking care of you in a locked down compound that no one else has access to.
Did you have some of those feelings when you were there as a young person?
I did. Like the drive-bys. He used to drive by every day in one of his Rolls Royces, and we'd all, stand at the side of the road and greet him in namaste. I did it, but it was more to hang out with the people around and to maybe to join in with the singing and dancing going on. than for me to be in contact with him. Like when there was opportunities to be close to him, a lot of people would scramble for it. I'd always sort of go the other direction. It seemed incongruous with what he was saying. And even as a young person, I knew that. But I never spoke to it because I wanted to belong to this community that was my home. So you did not challenge authority. You did not especially challenge Bhagwan's teachings because he was the God man.
Do you think there was any spiritual growth that happened alongside all of these controversies?
I think there are. I think so. A lot of it, the way I've thought of it is sort of like, it's really up to each individual what they get out of it, right? Like some people might have such purity in their intent that they will get something out of it. And I do think much of what he said was profound, but then he would contradict himself the next day. But some of it, if you really took it to heart, I think it could be profound and have some real spiritual meaning. And some of the meditations could have helped people break through certain barriers, and other teachings could have traumatized people.
Do you ever mourn the childhood that you might have had?
Yeah, so I do mourn having just a normal childhood. Like, I wish I sort of just had a more stable childhood. And then the interesting thing is sometimes I also mourn the community childhood, because when you come from that environment where you have so many people you know, to coming to a world where you don't know anybody, you feel very isolated. So it's that sense of like, I didn't have the chance growing up to build that community, and the community that I did, like in the outside world. And when the community I had, even though it was twisted and unhealthy, that is the community that I knew. So I mourn both.
What has your healing process been like to deal with all this trauma?
I mean, it's been sort of gradual. I think at first I had to just come to terms with the fact that I had spent 7 years of my formative years in a cult, and that I'd been sexually abused. Two things that were not even registering in my system until it was pointed out over and over. So I had to get to that. And then there's been many years of anger, and then many years of trauma therapy, and then a lot of grief, and then little crocuses of acceptance and wanting to just live the best life I can now.
How does what happened to you impact your life today? Does it still have an impact?
It can. I mean, I still find that sometimes I have that voice of doubt inside of me, or that I'm not doing things good enough, or there's the sort of lack of self-confidence. But then there's also that voice it's much more faint, but still is the cult think. I think, like what I said in the beginning, it's sort of like, oh no, you're making too much of that. Oh, you should have let it go. Oh, if you were a stronger person, you wouldn't have trauma. There's a bit of that still, but I am so familiar with it at this point that it doesn't run the show. It's more like, oh, there you are again. Sometimes still, if something happens that's triggering, it can derail me. But again, I don't go into the spiral for maybe months. It's more like I'll have a couple days where I just have to, hide from the world and try to process it.
Did it impact how you relate with men in your adult life?
Yeah, that's probably been my biggest regret, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm sorry. Does it still feel that way?
Yeah, it's really hard to trust where men are coming from. And so there's been many very kind men in my life who I didn't give a good chance to because of my own insecurity. Like that's a very visceral reaction, like, oh my God, you're gonna hurt me.
And you felt betrayed early on.
Yeah, so I felt so betrayed. So the fear of betrayal has been a very big theme in my life. And so then you sort of create the problem because you're testing the person, and the testing makes them feel nitpicked. So it's not a good combination. And so it's hard to I think one of the biggest things, not just with men, but having this level of trauma, is how do you let love in? Yeah, because you had to protect yourself because love wasn't safe, or at least what I thought was love turned out not to be safe. And so, I became pretty scrappy and protective and, constantly testing. And so that vulnerability is harder for me to access.
If you could tell your teenage self, your tween self, something now, what would you tell her?
I'm sorry, just I mean, I have so much appreciation for my younger self. I just tell her I'm so proud of how well she's come through it and how tenacious she's always been, what a survivor she's been. Because I don't know what would have happened to me if she wasn't strong. And I also understand why these defenses were there and that they in many ways saved me from worse abuse. So I mostly just have appreciation. But
Because when the commune collapsed in 1985, you were 16, all of a sudden you're thrust into this alien world, alone, with no money, no education.
No.
You said you didn't know the basic facts.
No.
What didn't you know?
I didn't know that the sun, I didn't know where the sun sets, even now I'm like befuddled. The sun sets in the west. I did not know that the sun set in the west. Basic stuff like that.
And you're sent out into the world. How did you survive?
It was scary, but it was sort of like when you're in that kind of survival mode, some other thing comes in and just you sort of don't realize how dire it is until after you're in survival mode. I was sort of loosely associated with some of the OSHO center in Southern California. I was there, but I had to pay to stay there. I couldn't get a job. I didn't know how to interview for a job. I was always just given a job. I had $300 and it was $10 a day, so I was just going broke very quickly, hitchhiking around. And many of my peers then turned to sex work or stripping. And as I was hitchhiking around, men, the one thing I did have that was marketable was my body, my young body, as did all of my peers, right? So people would ask me on the side of the road, well, do you want to make $50? And something in me, I've always had a very prudish leaning, despite growing up in a sex cult. My whole body was like, absolutely not. And at that point, I also had an epiphany about these men. And so I have to just call it grace, honestly. I have to call it grace. I think I just knew I had to get out of there, and I did. With my last $100, I left.
And somehow, through a relative, you end up getting your GED.
Yeah.
You end up going to college.
Mm-hmm.
You become an alternative health practitioner. You're involved in real estate. By all, the looks of it, you're very successful. How do you explain that resilience?
I have to say some of it's just there. I don't, what you call it, genetics or whatever, it's just there. It's just part of who I am. I think part of being a survivor my whole life probably set me up for that, because I've always had to be very sort of on the lookout and, observant. There's a healthy aspect and unhealthy, because I can drive myself really insane by being perfectionistic. But at that point, I feel like the timing was perfect and I was determined. And so I had met my grandfather, who was estranged from my mom, and my mom comes from an academic family, and he insisted I get a GED. And after a few months of us arguing, I kept saying, no, where I come from, education is brainwashing. That's why I didn't go to school. See, I'm pure, I didn't get brainwashed. And he's like, no, you have to get a GED. And so we sort of bargained, and I finally took it, and I passed. And I was 19 at that point, or 18. And so the timing was kind of amazing in the sense, again, grace, that I could slip back into the mainstream educational system in terms of my age. And so by the time I was 19, I had done 1 year of junior college and had straight A's, much to my own surprise. And then it transferred to a four-year university.
And you're in Boulder, you've been there for many years.
I've been in Boulder for like 36 years. And then, I worked as a technical writer for 15 years, and then I went back to school and became an acupuncturist. And then after that, I went back and got my real estate license. I feel like part of me is just a sort of entrepreneurial spirit. And I find that stuff, I find learning really satisfying.
You've been called a whistleblower, a trailblazer, and being so brave for standing up and speaking out about what happened. What do you think?
I mean, people say I'm so brave, but I actually don't. I mean, maybe it's brave, but I feel like it's one of those things like, what's the alternative? The alternative is me carrying it around and saying, in a way, by staying silent, saying, well, this was acceptable to some extent. And it's not acceptable. And so if that makes me a whistleblower, so be it. I mean, it is, but it's not like, when you're doing it for the right reasons, it doesn't feel like it's courageous. It just feels like it's aligned with my own principles. And my principles, were violated, and I need to stand in my own shoes and be aligned with my own sense of ethics and morality.
And the bottom line, what do you hope that readers and viewers take away from this story?
Yeah, so for my story personally, I hope they take away the sort of personal experience and how this kind of situation and sexual grooming and in the name of spirituality kind of evolves, because I tell the story from a very personal perspective, so it's not like full of judgment, so you can actually make up your mind and see how this type of process works in societies or in other spiritual movements. And in a bigger sense, I just hope people are much more aware of how sexual abuse is happening under your noses in all sorts of forms that may not be obvious.
And if you could speak directly to OSHO International Foundation, what would you say to them?
I would say, buck up. Like, treating us as if we don't exist without even speaking to us, or giving these sort of obtuse two-sentence remarks when you've been addressed by the press, it doesn't cut it. Like, if you are actually a spiritual movement, then walk the walk and do something to make it right for me and my peers.
Is there anything else I haven't asked you that you'd like to say?
No, I just want to thank you for having me, and I hope the story helps people that maybe don't have a voice.
Sarito Carroll, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your story once again. Sarito's book, In the Shadow of Enlightenment, your memoir. Thank you, Sarito.
Thanks.